Hello and welcome to this follow-up video on the Retro FC and GC26 Famicom stroke NES clone consoles. Today we're looking at the 2P controller and seeing if we can get working on the GC26 and can we get the NES controller working on these clone consoles. Okay, so the first thing I had to do was work out what protocol these consoles were actually using, and to do that I used one of these USB breakout boards and just connect it to breadboard, and then I could connect my oscilloscope and look at the signals. Perhaps not surprising, this is just a clone of an NES controller. It makes perfect sense, but at least I confirmed. Now there's some good videos online showing how an NES controller works, but I'll just show you briefly what's inside. So this is a PAL NES controller, but it's going to be the same for all regions essentially. So you have this 4021 shift register chip. So essentially what happens, the console says, hey, what's the state of the buttons? Are they pressed or not? They get latched into this chip, and then the console reads each button state in turn. Is the A button pressed? Is the B button pressed? And so on. That's essentially it. It means you can have loads of buttons over essentially 3 wires, 5 including power. Now, you may be thinking, well, this has a USB connector, so why is it not using USB protocol? It doesn't have to. Might not be the best practice, but they needed 5 connections. Micro USB and mini USB have 5 connections, which we'll have a look at now. So on standard USB there are only 4 connections, but let's get this right way around. If you can just about see that. So on mini and micro you have ground, ID, D+, D-, and V bus. ID is used for on the go, and it's also used by some chargers to say, hey, I'm the right charger, and they do that by putting a resistor like so. They put a resistor between ID and ground, or D+ or D- and ground, and essentially identifies the charger in a very simple way. That was useful for me because I needed a mini USB with 5 wires. I found this Garmin charger. They hadn't used all 5 connections of the mini USB, but they were present, and they put a resistor between ID and ground to say, hey, I'm the right charger. So that worked out well because it meant I could make up a cable. So what can we do with this knowledge? Well, we can connect an NES controller to this one or the other one, and we can also connect the clone controller also to the GC26. So first of all, let's start with the NES controller. So you'll notice I've just poked some wires into the NES controller socket, which is not the best thing to do, but just for temporary measures. And then all we have to do is connect the mini USB like so, power this on, and we will just go Super Mario Bros. To 2-player, and we will just, whoops, now it's Luigi time, and you can see it works absolutely fine like so, and obviously it's a lot better to use. So that's the NES controller. What about the clone controller? All we have to do is plug it in to here like so, and we should hopefully see it working. So again, there we go. Mario's not doing very well today. And don't forget the other controller is actually connected as well. Now the button layout on this is the same as on the Retro FC, so it's different to on here, which is a bit confusing, but it absolutely works. last thing is just talk about using this controller on an NES. I'm not going to show in action because there's not really any point apart from you have the turbo buttons, otherwise you should be using a proper controller. But this does work on an NES, but I had to do some conversions because I wasn't sure if this actually works on 5 volts, because these consoles output between 3.3 to 3.6 volts, and so 5 volts supplied by the NES might be too much. So what I did was just used 4 diodes to drop the 5 volt supply from the NES to about 3.3 volts, and used one of these level converters to convert the 5 volt latch and clock signals from the NES down to about, I think it's 3 volts I measured. And that way it worked absolutely fine. But again, as I said, you don't really want to use this controller on an NES, or maybe you've lost your controllers, it might be worth it. But it does indeed work because it is essentially an NES controller. Now, one little thing, if you're using a PAL console, so for some reason with PAL consoles, here is a socket from a PAL NES. Let's just zoom in a little bit. Now there's these arrangement of diodes which I believe are unique to the PAL version of the NES, and people seem to think it was sort of region locking, so you could only use PAL controllers. Actually, I think it was so you couldn't use American controllers on the PAL NES, something like that. But it might have been to meet certain requirements by the European regulations or something. But essentially what it means is you have to use 2 resistors to pull up the latch and clock signals, otherwise this type of controller, or any other controller that's not a PAL controller, that doesn't have the resistors inside here, it just won't work. So basically these 2 resistors here I've reproduced on here. But there you go. I hope that made some kind of sense. As I say, more details will be on my site, and thanks for watching. That's bye for now. Bye.